Welcome to our Together on Mission podcast, brought to you by the Baptist Union of Victoria and hosted by our Director of Mission and Ministries, Reverend Daniel Bullock. Daniel will be joined by a guest from our Victorian Baptist family each week for a brief discussion that aims to encourage you in your personal walk of faith and give you some practical suggestions that you can implement through your week. Throughout this year, the podcast will be focusing on the theme of being and sharing the good news. For the first 5 episodes, Daniel will be joined by Reverend Darrell Jackson, Acting Principal of Whitley Theological College, as they look together at the theme, being and sharing the good news, and how it relates to hope. Darrell is an Associate Professor, an astute theologian, missiologist, pastor, husband, father, and all-round good guy. And now, let's hear from Daniel and Darrell.
Today, I want to look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and reflect on verse 14, which says, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden." I wonder if we Christians really, truly agree with what Jesus is saying here. Often we spend a lot of our time trying to blend in, trying to convince people that we Christians are not weird. Often our churches strive to be accessible, which is fine, but sometimes we strive so much that there is very little cultural difference between the church and other community groups. Jesus says we are the light of the world and are to let that light shine. In the preceding verse, he says we are the salt of the earth and we're not to lose our flavour. I wonder if we truly believe this, believe that we can be a beacon for others, believe that our faith can be attractive, believe that God works not only in us, but through us. Of course, if we truly believe this, then we need to be continuously living it out. I think a good practical way we can shine the light is to go back to reflecting on Paul's teaching on the fruit of the Spirit found in Galatians chapter 5, verse 22-23. In those verses, Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, and faithfulness. When I talk about reflecting on these virtues, I'm talking about thinking or pondering upon them in a very deep way, but because we do have to delve deeply into their meaning. But I'm also suggesting more than that. I'm suggesting as we ponder them, we ask ourselves how we can live them out in our lives and interactions with others. How can these traits, practices, ways of functioning in the world become a normal part of my life and interactions with others? I think the fruit of the Spirit lived out in a Christian life is incredibly attractive and is what will help us shine the light of Jesus. But of course, it's not a matter of striving to be a better or a more godly person. To display the fruit of the Spirit, to shine the light of Jesus, we need to constantly surrender to Jesus, surrender our will to His, surrender our pride, our greed, and even our desire to fit in, maybe especially that. Surrender is closely followed by obedience to act on the promptings of God, to step out in faith and to be that person we're called to be. Or as the Apostle Paul puts it, to walk by the Spirit, be led by the Spirit, and keep in step with the Spirit. We are Christ's light, bearers of good news. Let's shine the light of Christ for this world. Darrell, how are we to understand the concept of light in the Bible? For instance, Jesus in John chapter 8 verse 12 said, "I am the light of the world." And in the passage I reflected on today, it says we, that is disciples, we believers, are the light of the world. How does this all fit together?
Yeah, Daniel, the theme of light, as you've suggested, runs throughout the Bible. And one of the things that often it speaks of is the light of God. And that's an awesome thing to consider. If you read in the Old Testament, there are many passages that seem to underscore this reality that you can't actually look at God directly. You can't gaze on God. And if you were to do that, you would die. I mean, it's pretty stark in the Old Testament, at least. And I guess it's a little bit like going out into the midday sun and staring at the sun for too long. Suddenly you're going to discover that your eyes are hurting and you may suffer at some point sun blindness. You just don't do it. So there is something about light that both reveals, makes things clear, but at the same time it conceals things, and it conceals clearly the one that you're looking at, in this case either God or Son. But there is something different about Jesus. I mean, something important about this claim that Jesus makes to be the light of the world, which is that in this very body of the Galilean, of the carpenter, the fisherman, there is something about this body, Jesus, God in the flesh, that reveals and yet at the same time also conceals God. However, the reality is that when we sing hymns in church, for example, I think of lines like, that God dwells in unapproachable light. There is something about Jesus that actually enables us to understand this is approachable light. We can approach this light. We can see God. We can see God in the flesh. And yet, at the same time, still, there is this sense which, just as Christ reveals who God is and God walks amongst people, at the same time, some things still remain concealed. There is still mystery. And I think that's what we carry through in our own witness as those who bear the light of Christ in our world, that we're called to explain, we're called to give an account of our faith, but we're also called to be honest and transparent about those things about which we do not yet fully understand, the mysteries, if you like, of God.
Thanks, Darrell. I really love that idea of Jesus as the approachable light that, in a sense, gives us access to God, so that we can look at God in a really wonderful way. So that's fantastic. I was wondering though, with this idea of light and being the light, in what practical ways can you give encouragement to our listeners about being light?
Yeah, well, I guess you and many other listeners have probably heard that little phrase which goes something like, when you face the darkness, it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. And, often lighting a candle seems such a futile, hopeless activity. And yet that's what we're called to be and to do, is to light the candle, to be the light. Now, in the churches in which I grew up, we often had the impression that Sunday morning particularly, but the life in the church was a place of lightness and brightness, and that the world outside the church was darkness and doomed. I think I've come to realize over the years that actually, although we still carry our light into the world and live as the light of Christ, yet there are nevertheless people, because they're made in the image of God, that we will speak to from time to time, that we will observe through their life, who actually in some way reflect that light of God, that created light. And I've often found, and this is borne out in stories that students have often told me, that in the conversations when they've tried and they've engaged with others, they've actually sensed the light of God in the world, shining somehow in the person they're talking to. And so I think the basic encouragement is to actually realize that when we go out as those who seek to follow Christ, to be the light of the world, we are not necessarily, as it were, carrying our candles alone. We will find others not yet part of the body of Christ, for whom the light of God is somehow present, and to make that more clear to them, I think, is part of what it means to be transparent and open and positive about the light that we carry.
That's so helpful, Darrell. Thank you so much. And my prayer for all of us is that we will indeed be approachable lights, that we will shine our light in the world, but we will find that spark in others as we go about that. Until next week, may you experience the blessings of God.